you can imagine these people have nowhere else to go, and if they are kicked to the fringes of the city, it costs them a lot more to travel back to the city to work, a lot more time, a lot more money. They can't find work in the outskirts of the city, right? So people don't want to move away from the city center, which is convenient, close to work, and with a lot of interesting street life and so forth. So the process of displacement of these older residents and poorer residents often accompanies gentrification. And this often results in political struggles as older residents resist the incursion of new capital like Eaton Street and so forth. So this process of disinvestment and reinvestment results in cycles of decline and gentrification that afflict the housing stock in a city. Right? So this is a general big picture. And community concern and resistance accompanies these changes, including the emergence of political protests and social movements, which are more and more obvious as Hong Kong are speeding up this cycle of gentrification. Now, in terms of the larger picture, you can actually see a wide, big historical process, which is a picture drawn from Western cities, and it's quite comparable to Hong Kong. But in terms of Hong Kong, the whole cycle starts actually after World War II, after the building of the public houses, and mostly in post-1970s. But in the West, it starts a little earlier. After the economic crisis, the Great Depression in the 1930s, there are waves of state-sponsored suburbanization, the people in the city center moving to the suburbs. Like Hong Kong, right, moving to suburban satellite towns like Tsuen Wan, like say Kwun Tong, right, like moving from the CBD to Hua Chun, and also to Sha Tin and so forth. So capital flat inner cities for more profitable locations, usually within the same region in the cities. Because those are less developed areas, that price is less. Moving people there actually creates a lot of profit margin for the real estate developers. So suburbanization continues for a few decades. And people start to move out from the older, more rundown parts of the city center, especially after the factories move out and less prosperous, empty industrial buildings, less prosperous workers, and so forth. So there is a deepening disinvestment from the inner cities fueled by a crippling devaluation of those land markets. And by the 1960s, there is also an increase in the population of middle class people and fresh demand for housing. So, and this earlier cycle of gentrification happened in large old cities throughout the world, like London, New York, Philadelphia, Toronto. Erroneously, this cycle is boosted as a return of people from the suburbs into the city center. But that's not very true. Right? Actually, it involves the more affluent denizens of the city rather than people coming back from the suburbs. It's actually the more affluent people moving into Wan Chai and Shanghai. And gentrification-induced displacement became a big problem in the 1980s as gentrification spread to cities and neighborhoods throughout the urban hierarchy. And anti-gentrification protest movements were common in the late 1970s and 80s all throughout the Western world, but dissolved after the late 1980s as national economies moved into recession, state welfare was retrenched, and support for activists eroded. And since the mid-1990s, a second wave of this gentrification process is actually expanding into new areas. And there are two ways of explaining gentrification. One is a consumption-based explanation, and is a production-based explanation. The consumption-based explanation says things like gentrification is dominated by the appropriation of consumer preference theory. It appropriates consumer preference theory to explain gentrification. It would say things like gentrification is a consequence of rational choice in the urban land market. In response to price signals, Alonso in the 60s said the middle class would rationally choose to live in the suburbs because the land is cheaper, gas is cheaper, and since then suburban land prices have risen and gas prices have gone up, and new rational choice in the middle class should be the inner city, and therefore they come back to the city center. My criticism of this kind of theory includes that the relative price of inner city and suburban land remain roughly the same, especially if you look at it in Hong Kong. And people are not really getting back to the city. It's a different kind of people going into these places. So the consumption-based explanation usually focuses on demand of the consumers and the changing lifestyles. But what would describe the situation in Hong Kong a lot better would be production-based explanation. Because it is difficult for consumption-based explanation to explain why a quantitative shift in economic demand resulted in a qualitative spatial shift of people going back to live in the city center. So production-based explanations focus more on the role of capital, of money, of investment in the production of gentrified neighborhoods. And cycles of capital investment and disinvestment lead to the creation of what we call a rent gap between capitalized ground rent under current use and potential ground rent under higher, better gentrified use. Let me show you this. Right? If this is a central business district, this is the amount of rent, the price of rent. It's highest near the city center, right? Near central business district. And the further away from the city and business and financial center, the lower the rent price. This is the actual rent. But because originally manufacturing actually happened nearer the city center than we thought. For example, in Wan Chai, in Sheung Wan, why there are tenement housing? Because tenement housing, Huanglao, is a kind of mixed-use architecture. What happens is it's usually around 3 to 5 stories high. In the ground floor, in the front, is the retail shop. At the back is the factory. The workers live upstairs as a dormitory. Sometimes the owner of the factory also lives upstairs. Sometimes they live further away. So in fact, the retail, the manufacturing, and the workers' residential area is all integrated in one single tenement building. Mochang Daya is like that. The shop front of the pawn shop is in the front. At the back and the second floor is a storage warehouse, right, and the offices, and then the workers lived and the owner also lived in the same building. So, and this is a concentration of a business area together with a residential and manufacturing area near the city center. That was how it was like in Wan Chai, in Sheung Wan, so on and so forth. So near the city center. But now, these places have become more run down. The manufacturing, the way we manufacture has changed. Right? We have moved our factories out to the other districts of the city, and also even that kind of manufacturing is gone. So Hong Kong is a small city, so even places like Samsui or Boon Tong, right? Places are actually quite near the center of the city, quite near what we call Tsim Sha Tsui and Central. Right? So it's still, but these places near the city center are now capital run out of it. It's disinvested, right? Capital running out to invest in other suburban areas. And therefore, the rent here near the center is actually, of course, at the center it's very, very expensive. Right? But near the center, there is actually a drop in the rent because of the poorer residents, poorer tenants. And therefore, if you redevelop this area, the rent gap is the amount of the bigger profit margin that you can get. So kicking out these people means higher risk, higher fuss, but also higher return, and quite a lot of people are willing to do this kind of investment.